But it's a real honor to be with you all. I appreciate you inviting me. And you know, we have not suffered from boredom yet in my office since I've been there. And I want to share a little bit with you what we're doing, just as examples of what I know the Tea Party across the country is focused on, and that's first principles. And the role states have, one, the role states have in pushing back on federal overreach, but also the necessity for just reining in the federal government. It isn't all about the states. We're actually a relatively small part of it. The real place you rein in the federal government is at the ballot box. I mean, that's the long-term solution. And, you know, as I describe it to folks, we keep catching these grenades they throw over the wall, and we throw them back. But we need people going through the wall and stop the grenades from coming over in the first place. And this November, we're going to have an opportunity in that respect. I kind of like the banner here. That's pretty good. But that's pretty good. But, you know, I really think there's more at stake in this year's election than in any that anyone in this room has ever lived through. The downside of losing is not something I want to contemplate. It really isn't.
Amen.
It's, even, you know, this is a potential transformational election. 1980 was the last one, and if we'd lost that one, obviously it would have been bad. But the downside of a second Jimmy Carter term, as miserable as that phrase may sound, is nothing compared to what we're facing now. It really is small potatoes, relatively speaking. And a big reason why, I mean, there's the dollars, just straight dollars. The balance sheet now is so much worse. And that's a bipartisan reality. That isn't just about President Obama. President Bush didn't help that situation either. Nor a Republican Congress, House and Senate, for 6 years at the beginning of the last decade. Until this administration, they were spending money like drunker sailors than anybody until this administration. And that's a big component. But the other piece is the first principles piece. And it is enormous. It's enormous. It is, we see the danger in the violation of the law by this administration day in and day out. I said about a month ago I had organized a report by my fellow attorneys general and myself. 9 of us put together 21 violations of the law, not policy disagreements. That list would be a lot longer, 21 violations of the law by the president or his administration. And I said, as we rolled out that report, that this president and this administration represent the greatest group of lawbreakers to ever run the federal government in our lifetime. And in 1 month, do you know how many times I've been challenged on that assertion? 0. Reported nationally, 0. The exception being not bloggers, but commenters on blogs, who largely would have to be censored for profanity, no, not substance, in the few times I've even seen anybody complain about it. That is understood by the American people. Now let's go back a little over 200 years. What would the founders think of that incredible abuse of the law itself? Remember what they established here, a nation that would be governed by the rule of law and not of men. We now have a president who complains that Congress won't do what he wants, so he's going to go do it himself. Constitution be damned. We have a president who's trying to intimidate the Supreme Court this week on a case because he thinks he's going to lose, and he doesn't want to. It's that simple. I remember listening to a radio interview during the 2008 presidential campaign of then Senator Barack Obama that was from somewhere in the 2001 to 2004 timeframe. And he was asked the question, as I recollect it, what do you think sin is? And his answer was relevant to our constitutional discussion. His answer was, doing something you think is wrong. what do you think the Commerce Clause means? Well, whatever I want it to mean. Right? That's pretty much the same thing. Pretty much the same thing. That rather defeats the purpose of a constitution. It also abandons the notion that we're a nation governed by the rule of law. They are attempting to accomplish the rule of men over the rule of law. They're steamrolling institutions. They're disobeying a court order in the District of Columbia in a case with the FCC about regulating the internet. Recess appointments, like that one, of a Democrat Senate. The Democrat Senate, not a Republican Senate, the Democrat Senate, just completely steamrolling that branch of government. This week, trying to intimidate another branch of government. There is so much evidence of the disdain for the rule of law itself and the first principles on which this country is built by this administration that we couldn't possibly recount it all in merely one night. And that's running till midnight. But I'm not going to run that long. What we have done in the EPA case, which we filed before the healthcare case, and I've taken to calling the EPA the Employment Prevention Agency, because they're so good at that. It's much more descriptive in what they're doing than Environmental Protection Agency. We sued them over their greenhouse gas endangerment finding, not because we didn't like it, but because it was illegal, that they violated the law in promulgating this regulation that, well, it's really a finding under which they promulgate regulations. And Lisa Jackson, the administrator of the EPA, under oath in front of the US Senate, said that by the year 2100, they still wouldn't be able to measure what they thought would be the benefit from the regulatory scheme. That's not Ken's assessment of the EPA's numbers. That's the EPA's assessment of the EPA's position. It'd be immeasurable, and as Rush Limbaugh would say, for those of you in Rio Linda, that means you can't measure it. Now, I was an engineer before I went to the dark side and went to law school, and this data and numbers actually matter to me. I want us to be right as a country, as a government. And the law expects it of agencies, though it gives them enormous benefit of the doubt in terms of the presumption that they are right. Now, let's look at one thing they did last week that's tied into these greenhouse gases, CO2 in particular. They effectively outlawed coal going forward in power plants. Now, remember when the president was running for office, I guess he is again, in 2008, he promised to bankrupt the coal industry. And this is a promise they're working harder than any other to keep. Any other. And last week was just the icing on the cake. The greenhouse gas rules targeted that. Last week's CO2 emissions restrictions at a level that no new coal plant, no matter how clean, can meet. Next week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, I'm going to Tazewell, Gate City, Christiansburg, Pulaski, Southwest Virginia. I'll be in Appalachia, the poorest part of America. You know what their industry is there? Coal. And that's it. That's it. One thing you all need to remember, and please tell your friends, tell people you don't like if they'll listen. The people hurt first and worst by this kind of across-the-board regulation are the poor. Never, ever forget that. We own the moral high ground. We own it. And we need to make the moral case for limited government. The founders did. There is a moral case to be made. There is a reason to limit government that isn't just to avoid annoyance by citizens or states. Because remember, it was the states that set up this federal government. We were here first, literally. And we have a role to play in restraining it. But the reality is, there is more at stake than just convenience or some system. Liberty itself is at stake. And the reason the founders set up a limited government, and the reason states have among their roles, one of them being to check that federal government's overreach of power, isn't to preserve states. States themselves were preserved for the further purpose of preserving your liberty, your freedom, your opportunity. Opportunity is liberty in the economy. And they're crushing it all over the place. And the people who will be hurt the worst are the poor. I talked to people, you all may remember when Reagan was president, that he talked about the economic pie, growing the pie, shrinking the pie, and that you could do this with good government policies or bad government policies, as we're seeing right now. I talk to people about the liberty pie. It doesn't grow and it doesn't shrink. There is one pie, it's the same size and it never changes. There are two slices: government power and citizens' liberty. Everything government does that expands its own power comes directly at the expense of your liberty. And there are three things government does to increase its own power: more taxes, more spending, and as we see with the federal government, those two aren't necessarily related, and more regulation. And the healthcare bill is regulation. It's just dictating to you how you can live or work, what you have to do or can't do. Those three things. The most confusing of them is, how does more spending decrease our liberty? Because it crowds us out. It crowds us out. Not to mention it equals future taxes. That's all it is. When you vote for bonds locally, you're voting for future taxes. Doesn't mean every bond is bad, but realize what you're doing. You know, we all take a bond out on our house. It's what it is. It's mortgage. There's some things it's appropriate to assume debt for, but it is a future tax. It will be paid for at some point. Those are the three ways government reduces our liberty. And this administration is busy at work on all three. All three. You listen to the attacks by the president on Paul Ryan's rather meager, I give him credit, but by the standards of what we're facing, rough attempt to rein in the growth of federal government. He doesn't shrink it. He just tries to slow it down. I don't think that's enough when you're running $1 trillion+ deficits. Nonetheless, listen to the president's attack on that. Not enough spending. Not enough spending. And that spending is reducing our liberty while it enslaves our children to debt and grandchildren to debt. And it puts our country in a position where liberty will be further squashed. How many of you have read Atlas Shrugged? A lot of you. If you haven't, you ought to read it. It's a long book, but we're living it. If you want the Cliff Notes, get The Road to Serfdom by Hayek.
Got it.
Yes. It's electronic. You can get an electronic form. The Reader's Digest version, literally, is 31 pages.
Scare you to death.
We are living the walk through government control to the squashing of liberty. And we have to push back. Each of you have to do it in campaigns, at the ballot box. I have to do it, all those places, and in my role as Attorney General. And I'm committed to that. And where is it more appropriate that we're leading in that effort, the pushback, than in the Commonwealth of Virginia, where Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, James Madison, by and large, wrote the Constitution, and Patrick Henry forced them to agree to a Bill of Rights. And he did. It was the only way to get the votes in Virginia. We take this Constitution for granted, but the vote that mattered in the Virginia Constitutional Convention was 88 to 80. 4 votes go the other way. 4 votes and no Constitution, because it wasn't going to happen without Virginia. It wasn't going to happen without Virginia. That's how close it was. Patrick Henry did not vote for it. Future President James Monroe did not vote for it. George Mason did not vote for it because it did not protect liberty sufficiently in their mind. I tell people jokingly that the earthquake we had last summer was Patrick Henry turning over in his grave. Hey, prove me wrong. So, what they would think is not an irrelevant consideration, and it offers some motivation. They sacrificed more in their time than anyone will be asked to sacrifice in the remainder of 2012. We have no excuse to remain idle. We have no excuse. And we have an eternal debt to over 1 million people who've given their lives and millions more who've sacrificed their time, been wounded, and their families in the service of this country to protect the first principles that are absolutely at stake this year. And all of them have delivered to us the opportunity to have this battle in peace. But we need to have this battle. We owe it to all of them. As I said, we're doing our part. I know so many of you have followed the healthcare case. I don't have to give you a blow-by-blow. We thought we were in the nothing can happen now, but we wait for the Supreme Court. Until the president came out and tried to intimidate the Supreme Court this week. And then today, you all may not have seen the Attorney General's letter in the Fifth Circuit. I'm sure you're all familiar with this. I've never seen a judge do this, but the tongue lashing the federal government took over the president's statements about judicial review, the court's ability to determine whether or not acts of Congress are constitutional, judicial review, and they filed the demanded 3-page letter brief. And there are certain things that are very interesting about it. First of all, they concede judicial review exists. That's good. It's a good start. It's more than the president has done this week. Well, no, he backed off some later. He suggested it did exist. But and after they walk through all that, the very last line by the Attorney General is, and this is all consistent with what the president's statement. That one difference between conservatives and liberals, we accept reality for what it is. That's a big difference. A big difference. Included in that letter is sort of a dressed up extension of the president's attack. A press for, it's under number 3 in the letter. When you pull it up, I'm sure it'll be all over the internet by the time you get home. Number 3 there, it's only about a page long. They talk about the deference courts have shown to Congress on the constitutionality of acts, which is true. It's a co-equal branch of government. The benefit of the doubt goes to the Congress, but not when it ain't close. And the language they use there is very strong set of quotes, and they cite 2 judges healthcare on the healthcare case. Now, mind you, this Fifth Circuit case about something, it's about a part of the healthcare bill. It's about the physician's ability to own practices, hospitals. It's not, hasn't been litigated yet. And they cite 2 judges, Judge Silberman in D.C. and Judge Sutton in the Sixth Circuit. Not coincidentally, in my view, Republican appointees who voted that the mandate is constitutional. The only 2, I think. And when you couple that with the rather aggressive restatement of the president's position that they shouldn't be touching this, it really sounds to me like no apology at all. It's as I was on Larry Kudlow earlier tonight, it's a non-denial denial, which, you know, is kind of par for the course, this administration. So I thought we were in that, I call it black box period, with like a jury, once they go in the jury room, they're in the black box. You can never penetrate the black box to figure out what's going on there. Well, the president's still trying to affect the outcome, and I strongly suspect he will. Just not the way he'd like to. You know, when I first ran for office, I wasn't supposed to run. They had somebody picked out. Does this sound familiar? It's like next year, you know? But this was 10 years ago. It's deja vu all over again. And I got in the race against a Republican state senator to knock out an incumbent. He went into the Warner administration, and so then his chosen person got in the race, and 20-year establishment guy, and you know, I call them establishment conservatives, but in that order. Establishment comes first, and which is the biggest problem in the Republican Party. Now, this is a different party, but that's the biggest problem we got in the Republican Party. And just person after person came to me to tell me all the reasons I shouldn't be running, and, you know, I was disrupting everything, and blah, 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 yada, 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 yada. And they obviously didn't know me very well. I thought about everything they said and got more and more and more motivated with every single person that came to me. Because I knew what part of, even back then, that was part of our problem, and that was just an expression of it. It was just an expression of it. I think the voters are pretty well fed up with being told who they get to vote for. And in my case, for next year with the lieutenant governor, if the people of Virginia want the lieutenant governor as their Republican nominee for governor, guess what? They're going to get him, because they're going to vote for him. But we're going to do this competitively. If the Republican Party is going to return to being the party of free markets and free competition, we're going to practice what we preach, and I'm going to make them do it. I'm going to make them do it. And that has garnered great gnashing of teeth and wailing and all sorts of other terrible sounds that make good coyote calls, but they're not much good in politics. I have coyotes killing my chickens, so I have it on the brain. But and we'd like y'all's support in that race. That's after 2012. We don't want necessarily your effort, but we'd sure appreciate your commitment and your support now. These two guys over here. These two guys right here are point people for us in this county, and I appreciate that. And so if you're willing to get on board with us now, we're not going to ask a ton of you now. We have our eye on the ball too. And unlike any race in my lifetime in Virginia, we are a critical swing state from day one in this race. And we are focused on that. Now, as it is, I don't have the luxury of waiting until 2013 to start putting pieces in place in a governor's race, especially against a competitor who's really been running for 2.5 years. So we'll do those, but with discretion, to make sure we don't detract from the mission this year. That is the priority. And if I could only pick one race in the whole rest of my life to win, it would be the presidential this year. And that's well worth losing all the rest of the ones I may ever be in. That's how important this one is, and we got to keep our eye on that. With that, I'm happy to take some questions, and I want to tell you all I appreciate the support of so many of you to get into the Attorney General's office. We did awfully well in this county, actually better than I've done in any precinct of my Senate district, in any race for the Senate, but as a conservative in Fairfax, I was covered by the Endangered Species Act, so I don't get that. But thank you all very much.